haven't wanted to connect with someone in so long. I want to see this through, the whole thing." That's the line he found on her phone. Not a confession, not an apology. A text message, sent to another man, from the woman he had been married to for 10 years. Daniel was 39 years old, standing alone in his own kitchen on an ordinary afternoon, reading words his wife had written to somebody else, words that made it very clear she wanted more than the one kiss that had already happened in a parked car after work. He read the message twice, then a third time, like maybe it would say something different if he looked again. It didn't. He sat on what he'd found for 2 weeks before he said a word. 2 weeks of watching his wife make dinner, help with homework, kiss him goodnight, all while he carried this alone. When he finally told her he knew, within hours she would be in a hospital bed, having swallowed a bottle of pills on the drive home from that conversation. This is a story about the moment a marriage almost ended, and about the 10 years that came after it. Some of it will make you angry. Some of it might make you rethink everything you thought you knew about second chances, about mental illness, about what it actually takes to stay. To understand how Daniel and Claire ended up in that kitchen, you have to go back further, to a marriage that, on paper, looked completely ordinary. The kind of marriage nobody watching from the outside would have flagged as fragile. They'd been together 10 years, married the whole time. 3 kids under the age of 10 filled the house with noise and chaos and left almost no quiet space for the two of them to just be a couple. Daniel worked constantly, the kind of job that swallowed mornings and swallowed evenings, too, that left him walking through the door already spent. Claire worked 2 nights a week. Not much, on paper, but enough that she still felt like she had a foot outside the walls of their house, a version of herself that existed beyond diaper bags and school lunches. Somewhere in the grind of mortgage payments and pickup lines and bedtime routines, the two of them had quietly drifted from each other. Not in any dramatic, cinematic way, just the slow erosion that happens to a lot of marriages once the kids arrive and romance gets shuffled to the very bottom of a to-do list that never actually ends. Daniel noticed the changes in her before he understood any of them. Claire started dyeing her hair a different color. She began dressing differently. Younger, sharper, like she was trying on a version of herself she hadn't worn in years. She picked fights over almost nothing, small sparks that turned into arguments neither of them could really trace back to a cause. He chalked it up to stress. 2 working parents, 3 young kids, a marriage running on fumes. That was reason enough, he figured, for some friction. He didn't yet have language for what was actually happening inside his wife's mind. That language would only arrive later, wrapped in a diagnosis neither of them saw coming, delivered in a hospital room neither of them wanted to be sitting in. Because underneath all of it, something else had been quietly building for months. Claire was moving into a hypomanic episode, a symptom of a condition that hadn't been named yet, that neither of them knew was sitting underneath their entire marriage like a fault line. To Daniel, at the time, it just looked like his wife pulling away from him. Looked like a woman getting ready to become someone else, someone he didn't fully recognize. It was an ordinary afternoon when Daniel had the house to himself for once. The kids were out, Claire was at work, and instead of enjoying the rare quiet, something nagged at him, low and persistent, the way a splinter does. Call it instinct. Call it the slow accumulation of 6 months of strange little signals finally reaching a tipping point he couldn't ignore anymore. He picked up her phone. What he found wasn't a full-blown affair, not physically. It was a coworker. One night after work, in his car, the two of them had kissed. That was as far as it had gone physically, and Claire would later swear to Daniel that it truly never went further than that single kiss. He believed her on that specific point. But it wasn't the kiss that broke something open in him. It was the messages. In them, Claire wasn't hiding what she wanted, and she wasn't being vague about it either. She told this man she hadn't felt that kind of pull towards someone in a long, long time, and that she wanted to see where it could go, the whole thing, in her words. The coworker, as it turned out, didn't feel the same way. He turned her down. That one fact, that the door had been shut from his side, not from any restraint on Claire's part, would end up being one of the hardest things for Daniel to sit with in the months that followed. It meant the only reason nothing more happened wasn't her conscience. It was his lack of interest. Daniel didn't say anything right away. For 2 weeks, he carried what he knew by himself, turning it over and over at night while Claire slept beside him, deciding what to do with it, maybe hoping some of the sting would dull before he had to say the words out loud. It didn't dull. If anything, it sharpened. Eventually, he sat her down and told her he knew. Claire's reaction wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a fight either. It was something far more frightening than either of those. Before she even made it home from that conversation, she'd taken a large number of pills in the car. A friend reached her in time to realize something was badly wrong and got her to the hospital. Daniel spent that entire night not processing betrayal anymore, not thinking about a coworker or a text message. He spent it sitting in a waiting room, not knowing whether his wife was going to survive until morning. She was admitted on suicide watch. And in the days that followed, doctors gave the crisis a name: Bipolar 2, along with confirmation that Claire had been living inside a hypomanic episode for months without either of them realizing it. Suddenly, the hair, the clothes, the fights over nothing, the pursuit of another man, all of it had a clinical explanation sitting quietly underneath it, one that had been there the whole time, invisible. It didn't erase what had happened. Daniel was careful never to pretend it did. But it reframed it, gave the events a shape that made a little more sense than pure betrayal alone. Claire was released only a few days later, faster than is typical for someone who'd just been on suicide watch. She told Daniel she'd been highly motivated to get home to the kids, and that she'd said what she needed to say to the doctors to make that happen sooner. Daniel had his doubts about how much of that quick release was real progress and how much of it was performance for an audience of doctors deciding whether she was safe to send home. But he didn't have the luxury of sitting with those doubts for long. He had 3 kids, a mortgage, a job that didn't pause for any of this, and a wife who had just tried to end her own life. Whatever uncertainty he felt, he became her caretaker almost immediately, because there was simply no one else standing in line to do it. And this is the moment. This is the moment a lot of people, looking in from the outside, would have already walked out the door. Daniel didn't. Not because it was easy, and not because the anger and hurt disappeared. He loved her. He was honest about that in his own telling. And at the exact same time, he genuinely didn't know, night to night, whether he could actually get past what she'd done. They started therapy. Individual sessions for each of them, and couples counseling on top of that. There were moments of real, unguarded intimacy in those early weeks, flashes of the marriage they used to have. But there were also long stretches where Claire simply didn't have the energy to meet him halfway. She was adjusting to new medication, relearning the shape of her own mind, trying to survive the diagnosis that had just upended everything she thought she knew about herself. Daniel found himself the one reading the marriage books at night, the one doing most of the emotional labor of holding the relationship together, even while he was still quietly bleeding from what she'd done to him. He felt guilty for not being over it after only 2 months. He knew, rationally, that 2 months wasn't very long at all in the scope of a betrayal like this. Knowing that didn't stop the guilt from showing up anyway, uninvited, most nights. And then came the night that finally pushed him to sit down and write about it publicly, for strangers, because he didn't know who else to ask. After an attempt at intimacy fell apart between them, Claire was simply too tired that night. Nothing more sinister than that. Daniel found himself back on his phone in the dark, searching the other man's name again. This time, he found the guy's Twitter account. And there, on the exact night of the almost affair, this man had tweeted about having a crush on someone. Underneath it, what looked like an inside joke in a follow-up post. Daniel knew, logically, that the man had turned Claire down. He'd seen the text messages himself, seen the rejection in black and white. But sitting there at midnight, exhausted and raw and freshly stung by his own wife turning away from him in bed, logic wasn't winning that particular fight. The question just kept circling, over and over. What was the joke? What didn't he know? When Daniel first shared his story, the responses came in fast, blunt, and mostly pointed in the same direction. One commenter told him to stop focusing on the fact that Claire had been rejected and start focusing on the intent underneath her actions. The fact that she'd gotten dressed up for another man, treated her own husband poorly in the process, and had made it explicitly clear in writing that she wanted to go much further than a kiss. That commenter asked Daniel directly whether this was really the person he wanted to keep fighting to stay married to, or whether he was only staying because the other man had happened to say no. A second reader zeroed in on the sequence of events rather than the affair itself. The fact that instead of coming home and having an honest conversation, or even continuing to lie her way through it, Claire's response to getting caught was a suicide attempt. That same commenter pointed out, not unkindly but pointedly, that Daniel had tried to be intimate with her again not long after all of this, and gently suggested he might be putting her on a pedestal instead of seeing the relationship clearly for what it was. A third voice picked up on the very last detail from his post, the failed attempt at intimacy because Claire was too tired that night. This commenter asked the exact question that had clearly been eating at Daniel too. Would she have turned down the other man that same way if he'd wanted her the way she'd wanted him? The suspicion here wasn't that Claire was still actively pursuing anyone. It was something colder and more specific, that her guilt seemed to center more around getting caught than around the choice she'd actually made in the first place. A fourth commenter took a more clinical tone, questioning how much weight Daniel should be putting on a diagnosis that had arrived so conveniently right after the affair came to light, even while acknowledging that bipolar disorder is real and that hypomania can absolutely distort judgment. It was a fair point buried inside a skeptical one. Sympathy and accountability aren't always the same thing, and a diagnosis doesn't automatically resolve which one applies here. A fifth reader took a gentler angle, one of the few that didn't push Daniel toward the exit. This person pointed out that suicidal crisis and infidelity, however connected they turned out to be, needed to be handled as two separate emergencies, that Daniel was allowed to grieve the marriage he thought he had while also doing everything he could to keep his wife alive, and that neither one canceled the other out. Underneath all the different angles, most of the responses landed in roughly the same place: skepticism. Skepticism that Claire was genuinely remorseful rather than simply frightened of the consequences. Skepticism that a marriage built on this kind of fracture could actually hold. A quiet, fairly unanimous expectation that Daniel was heading toward heartbreak, whether or not he could see it yet from where he was standing. Daniel read every comment. And for years afterward, that's exactly where his story stayed frozen. A single snapshot of a marriage at its absolute lowest point, with strangers on the internet quietly placing their bets on how it would end, most of them betting against him. He actually tried to post an update once, years later, somewhere around the anniversary that had always hit him the hardest. It never made it through, caught by an automated filter, lost before anyone could read it. So the story simply stopped there for anyone following along. Unfinished. A cliffhanger nobody chose on purpose. Until a full decade after that first post, Daniel finally sat down to write the rest of it. 10 years later, Daniel, now 49, a fact he noted with a kind of tired disbelief, sat down to finish the story he'd started as a much younger, much rawer version of himself. Someone who hadn't yet learned any of what the next decade would teach him. He opened with something that read almost like a joke at his own expense. All that advice from a decade earlier, the near-unanimous verdict from strangers online telling him to leave, to protect himself, to stop putting his wife on a pedestal, he called it reasonable. Good advice, even on its own terms. And then, plainly, without hedging, he said he was glad he hadn't taken any of it. He was still married, still in love with his wife, now 49 herself. He was careful not to make it sound like a fairy tale. There were still things they worked on, the way any long marriage has things it works on. But looking back with 10 years of distance behind him, what had happened wasn't quite the story he thought he was living through in the moment. It had been, in his own words, a hypomanic episode driven by a bipolar 2 diagnosis that nobody had caught in time, one that the depression medication Claire had been taking at the time had actually made worse, not better, without either of them knowing it. He admitted something quietly devastating and quietly hopeful, almost in the same breath. He had genuinely forgotten the other man's name. The man whose Twitter he'd once scoured at midnight, whose supposed inside joke had kept him awake staring at the ceiling, Daniel called forgetting that name a kind of progress. a small, strange marker of just how far he'd traveled from the man who'd once needed to know the answer so badly. Every May, for the first several years, the anniversary of that night, the night he found out, the night of her suicide attempt, hit him hard, without needing a calendar reminder. His body just seemed to know. But each year, it softened a little more than the year before, and this 10th year, the anniversary came and went without him even registering it. He only realized, sitting down to write this very update, that the date had already passed by more than a week. The life he described now was almost unrecognizable from the wreckage of that first post. He and Claire took vacations together, just the two of them. They were intimate multiple times a month, no longer something either of them had to force. They had real plans for the future, small, ordinary dreams that only exist inside a marriage that isn't running on survival mode anymore. A pop-up camper once the kids were older, real travel once the house finally emptied out. But the update wasn't just a highlight reel, and Daniel didn't let it read like one. He was specific about what had actually changed underneath the surface, in the quiet, unglamorous work nobody posts about. Through years of couples therapy, he'd learned something about himself that had nothing to do with Claire at all, how important it was for him, personally, to be okay standing on his own. He said plainly that if he ended up divorced someday, for this reason or any other, he would survive it. He'd rebuilt his own identity in the years since, his own hobbies, his own sense of worth that no longer depended entirely on whether the marriage made it. And Claire had done her own work, separate from him, alongside him. She'd continued treatment for her mental health with professionals, year after year, learning to manage the highs and lows that had once driven her toward a coworker's car, toward a bottle of pills, toward a hospital bed on suicide watch. She hadn't been cured. Bipolar disorder doesn't work that way, and Daniel never pretended otherwise. But she'd learned, through real, sustained effort, how to keep the worst of it from taking the wheel again the way it once had. Daniel didn't pretend the outcome was universal, and he was careful to say so directly. Divorce and separation, he wrote, are sometimes exactly the right answer for a lot of people in situations that look a lot like his used to. He wasn't naive enough to think his own marriage was guaranteed to last forever just because it had made it this far. But he wanted the people reading his update, especially the ones sitting right where he'd once sat, in a waiting room at 2 a.m, to know that walking away isn't the only path through something this painful. Sometimes, he wrote, you can work through it and come out the other side actually happy, not just surviving. His closing line back to his own decade-old post was almost wry, almost fond. He said he was glad, looking back, that he hadn't followed the fairly unanimous advice everyone had given him at the time. The comments this time around were a different tone entirely. One person teased him lightly about wanting a pop-up camper of all things, after everything he'd been through, to which Daniel, with the kind of dry humor that only comes from having survived something much harder than a budget conversation, replied that they actually wanted an Airstream, but good luck affording that in this economy. Another reader simply thanked him for coming back after 10 years to finish the story, for showing what a genuine long-view update can look like, and said it gave them real perspective, the kind you can't get from a story frozen at its worst moment. Here's the thing, this story isn't trying to argue that what Claire did was fine, or that every marriage that survives an affair automatically proves the marriage was worth saving. It's not asking you to forgive her. What it offers instead is something rarer, a full-circle look at what happens when two people choose to stay inside the hardest chapter of their relationship long enough to actually find out whether there's a next one. Daniel didn't get there by pretending the betrayal never happened, or by rewriting it into something smaller than it was. He got there through years of therapy, through nights of real doubt, through an anniversary that used to flatten him every single May and eventually, quietly, stopped. And he only got there because Claire did her own work too. Not once, not for a single dramatic season, but continuously, for an entire decade. If you'd been sitting with Daniel in that hospital waiting room, right at the start of this story, not knowing if his wife was going to make it through the night, would you have believed him if he told you where the two of them would be 10 years later? We'd love to know what you think. Do you believe 10 years of real work can genuinely undo something like this? Or is a marriage that survives an affair always going to be a different, lesser version of what it was before? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more real stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. We've got a lot more of them coming.